Hello everybody, welcome back to the channel. It is Saturday, which means it is time for the weekly progress update for our game dev. This week has been quite interesting. It's the first time we have attempted to record both MKV and MP4 footage at once, and I was almost sure that OBS would not let us run two instances at the same time and record two different presets, but hey, it seems like it worked and my computer didn't take a dump in the process, so you know what? This might have just made these update videos viable to create again. Anyways, why don't we dive right into it and see what sort of progress we've made during this week. My main focus for the Child of Ether project this week was to integrate the quest system and the dialogue system together, link them in such a way where when you talk to NPCs, when they reach certain messages in their dialogue dictionary, they can give the player a quest. And not only that, that quest should appear in a very physical form. Kind of like when you look at games like Fallout, when you get a quest, there's a big fat title that just flies into the screen, and it makes it very clear that you have a new quest, you have some tasks that come with that quest, and I wanted to make sure that in my game that is just as clear. We spent a decent amount of time designing the user interface for the quest pop-up and the task pop-up, and of course, just like a lot of other mechanics, my approach to this is very modular, so I decided to go with a singleton, which would allow me to create this pop-up system to exist on top of the entire game, and all I have to do is just address that singleton and call a custom function that is gonna force a pop-up to animate itself. I used Godot Engine's animation player in order to set up the transitions, the fade in and fade out, the animation, the quest coming in, staying for a few seconds and then going away. And this is where I have to consider that because there can be a lot of different ways that a quest could be organized, like for example, you can get a quest but no immediate tasks, although that would be a little weird. You could get a quest and get one task, or you could get a quest and get 5 or 7 or 10 tasks in a row. Like for example, if you are collecting ingredients for some NPC for some sort of a recipe, then it would be kind of annoying where if they give you one recipe piece, you go and fetch it, you return, and then they give you the next recipe piece and you go and fetch it and return. I mean, don't get me wrong, you can do it this way. I don't think that might be the most interesting way for the players to experience it. So in that case, if they get all the ingredients as separate tasks, this means that my pop-up system has to make sure that it can display all the tasks no matter how many tasks there may be. This was achieved with the help of the VBox container node in Godot Engine, which allows you to deposit as many child control nodes into it, and it's simply going to organize them in a nice list fashion, and you don't have to bother with things like dimensions and margins and spacing. I mean, all of those properties are still available to you in the inspector, but that's really trivial to what we're trying to create here. By using a VBox container, it basically meant I can add as many tasks into that VBox container as I wish, and none of those tasks would ever overlap. Not only that, each and every task only has to stay on the screen for just a couple of seconds. So to achieve that, I've created a single task as a scene, and then as the NPC is going through the dialogue system, the dialogue that the player is participating in, if the NPC hits a quest-giving message type, it is simply gonna execute that message. It is going to talk to our task giving pop-up, and it's going to simply tell it, can you display another task, while I go ahead and add it to the player's quest dictionary. Now, the dialogue system is built in such a way where I can cascade these task-giving messages as many times as I want. The NPC is going to simply zoom through all of them until it reaches the next static message, like a piece of text that it's supposed to display. So the whole process is really instantaneous, but when the actual task gets added to the list, there's a little bit of an animation of it kind of fading in and fading out. And the fade out is achieved by squishing the size of the rich text label. So it looks like when you have 5 different messages, they all pop up one after another. They don't all pop up at once. Instead, they pop up one after another with a little bit of a timer delay. And when the timer runs out, instead of just disappearing, which of course, if we queue free the task, everything just pops upwards, like it's just been instantly deleted. Instead of doing that, I simply shrink the size, the height of the rich text label. That allows it to very smoothly free up its own space to the next task, and then once it's small enough that we can't perceptibly see its size, it just destroys itself. It's a very modular system that at this point I really don't have to add anything extra. The only thing I will have to come back and rework is the visual presentation, the font choices, the backdrops, maybe make some sort of a little tiny strip or a panel, experiment with what would make the entire thing be a little bit more presentable. Because right now it's a little bit improvised. It could work. I'm not a huge fan now that I kind of look at it, having worked on it a little while ago. So this is essentially where we stand. So, a summary of what we've actually achieved. We managed to get the NPC to list a number of subjects and then cycle through the individual messages, kind of a conversation, until we reach a quest-giving feature. Now, when they reach the quest-giving and the task-giving messages, you can see the pop-up appears, we see the number of tasks that we've been assigned, and the task and quest-giving operations are actually two separate message types, so I can always simply add additional tasks without having to add another quest. Now, here we check that when we talk to the other NPC, we do see that we got a quest in our journal, and not only that, this NPC only presented us with that particular dialogue option because we had a quest already in our quest dictionary. This is something that allows us to make sure that certain dialogue options don't appear until you complete a certain quest. And this is of course so that we don't walk up to a random NPC and end up seeing endgame dialogue when we're just in the beginning of our journey. So I would say the most important part of the dialogue feature is the fact that we can make certain dialogues of other NPCs appear if we meet certain criteria. Not only that, there's different types of dialogue progressions. Like, for example, you can walk up to an NPC and start a particular discussion on a particular subject or a particular dialogue, and then we can either just end that dialogue right then and there and exit out of the dialogue, and the player's gonna go do some sort of a quest for them. And then when they come back, the NPC doesn't start with a list of dialogue options right away. Instead, they actually just continue from where they left off, perhaps performing some sort of a quest check or item check in your inventory. And if you meet the criteria, then the conversation will continue and reach the end of the conversation, and only then would it print the list of dialogues that you can choose again. Now, that particular option allows us to make it so that NPCs can give a player a task and not progress their dialogue, and not give the player too much late game information unless they actually do some sort of a favor, some sort of a task for this NPC. Alternatively, we can also make the character list the list of dialogues that we can inquire them about, and then when we click on one, we go through the array of all the messages that we're supposed to have in that conversation, and by the end of the conversation, we can make the NPC simply relist the list of subjects that we can talk to them about. Another type of message that's built into this dialogue system is the ability to hide and reveal dialogue subjects. So the character is gonna end up having maybe dozens of dialogues that we can talk to them about, especially if they're a key character that we keep running into and interacting with all the time. So of course, not all of those dialogues should be visible right away. That's why we need to have the ability to hide and reveal dialogues manually. We also should have the ability to hide and reveal dialogues using some sort of criteria, like, did you finish a quest? Or do you have some sort of an item in your inventory? In that case, we're gonna let you engage in this particular dialogue. After this, I wanted to switch gears a little bit and tackle this particular effect I've been meaning to put into the very beginning room within which the player awakens in this world, which essentially is a set of moon rays coming from the window, catching a little bit of the dust, and the tiny bit of basically faked volumetric lighting. These particular tricks I've just started noticing in older games that I've been revisiting, some really simple childhood games. A lot of those effects are still very quite much usable today, especially if you're working on a particularly stylized game. You don't have to involve latest technologies to achieve these effects. The tricks of the old days are still very quite much useful today, especially for indies. This particular effect is actually very easy to achieve. All we do is we start by modeling out a very simple, very skewed stylized window, after which we proceed to UV map and texture it. And for this one, I decided to texture it straight in Blender because for this particular game, there's actually no need for a lot of the fancy pants maps like normals, height, and roughness. There might be some use for certain effects like maybe water puddles, but for the most of it, it's basically just a two-dimensional cutout board, 2D in the 3D world, inky style aesthetic. There's very little need for any reflections or metallic effects or anything of the sort. The most I would probably go with is ambient occlusion. That could actually be very helpful. But because our texturing demands are very minimal, I decided to texture it straight inside of Blender. Blender has the ability to create empty image files, and it has a built-in image editor. People use Blender as a two-dimensional art creation tool, and there's a lot of really interesting features and interesting tools in Blender that allow you to combine 2D and 3D workflows. So I figured I might save myself some time and simply create the texture directly in Blender. Now, I'm not a fan of Blender's 2D toolset. It seems a little ass backwards. First of all, there's no eraser. There's no eraser. You can just paint over your objects. There's no layers. What kind of a painting program doesn't have layers? And Googling for these general questions reveals that there's a lot of people who are, well, who have been hoping for an overhaul on that end of a Blender as well, but it's not impossible to create simple two-dimensional textures with Blender. It's, well, there's a reason why I use Substance and not Blender for texturing. Nevertheless, I did manage to get a proper texture in. If you make any mistakes, it's a bit more of a hassle because there's no layers. You can't really add additional details on a separate layer and then bake it together, or technically you can, but it's more work than it's worth. Now, for something like this, you can even go the good old-fashioned way and just UV map your object, export the UV map layout into your, say, Krita or Photoshop or Paint.net or other painting program, and simply create the texture there. But I do appreciate the ability to paint on a three-dimensional object and be able to see what the texture looks like right away without having to export, paint in a separate program, export from there, load it back up into Blender, and have to assess it that way. It just takes too long. After this, we create the geometry for our light rays. I initially tried to create like a separate plane, but in the end I decided, you know what, whatever, let's just extrude the window shapes right away themselves, because they already happen to be perfectly shaped after the rectangles that the rays are supposed to be mimicking. Of course, the light rays required their own texture, and I achieved the whole stretched ray effect by simply creating noise texture, some sort of a randomly painted piece, and simply stretching it to absolute no end in order to create very long streaks to simulate clustered moon rays. We also had to make sure that the rays slowly disappear as they go further and further into the room, at least for our particular effect. I thought that would be a good idea. So we had also overlaid a gradient texture over the rays in order to give them some way to dissipate into darkness. Now, you might consider, why is it that we're using a gradient instead of using, say, like transparency? Well, the reason being is because transparency tends to be kind of buggy with Godot. It's a really weird thing. When you involve a lot of transparency works, you end up dealing with weird layering and weird render pass issues. Things that are behind tend to end up getting drawn on top. Especially it becomes a mess when you start dealing with like back faces. So it is for that reason that I decided, instead of doing transparency, I instead would use additive blending. And with additive blending, which is just a little checkbox you toggle in the material blend mode, all you have to really do is toggle on additive blending, and what it does is anything that's dark, anything that's black, gets essentially blended in as nothing, so it appears as if it's fully transparent, and anything that is white or anything that starts getting brighter and brighter and brighter gets added to any sort of pixels that you see behind. So that ended up producing a much better effect, and it almost has this glowy effect to it without really involving any emissive data. In the end, I did end up actually dropping the same exact material over the emissive map in the spatial material, and that just kind of made the rays pop in the darkness. Now, after this, all I had to add is just a little bit of dust floating in the air, dust that would only be visible inside of these rays, and we didn't really do any special masking. All I did is just shrink down the dimensions of the particle emitter just to the general dimension of the ray, and that was basically it. That was the whole effect. The final portion of this effect was actually to program the UV offset. Now, I wanted to make the rays kind of cascade and move along the UV, so they would almost scroll. It would allow us to simulate an effect of the dust smaller than what we can see passing through the rays and casting a shadow. Again, very cheap effect. All we had to do is to offset the texture in the UV map. Now, for some reason, I decided to create a separate shader and then add a uniform to it and scroll the texture using that little uniform. But I really didn't need to do this. Why am I doing this? Now that I'm kind of looking at it, I could have just used a spatial material, and you can talk to that spatial material and you can address its values, like its UV coordinates, and you can just talk to, let's say, X or the Y coordinate or the Z coordinate and simply make that scroll across the map. There really was no need for a whole separate shader, but maybe that was just me experimenting and I didn't catch on to the simple spatial node idea until way after I've already finished it. Now, the next segment I wanted to take care of is the combat system. The combat system is something I've been, well, dreading for a project like this, because inherently the way you control the camera and the way you control the character isn't akin to your standard RPG games. You don't click on the location where you want the character to go, you use WASDs to move it there. But at the same time, I didn't want to then also reserve the mouse click to damage the enemies or to target the enemies, like, for example, you can in Diablo games. As a matter of fact, I didn't want to go for the standard RPG route either, where you just click a bunch of buttons and to execute attack 1, attack 2, special attack, anything like that. I really wanted something different. I wanted to come up with something that's particularly unique to this game, and this kind of got me thinking about other games that had an unconventional approach to let's say the combat system, like for example Undertale. Undertale passes itself as a standard like RPG game that's actually an adventure game in disguise, and the way it handled combat is when you engage in a battle with a particular NPC, instead of seeing a standard RPG turn-based mechanic, we got this really interesting system where you have to physically evade attacks of the other character within this little tiny window. It was essentially a mini game within a main game, and I thought the whole concept was very interesting. It's very unique. It was an interesting different spin on the whole RPG adventure. So I was impressed with the ingenuity of the combat system, but now I have to somehow come up with just as unique of an approach for my own project. So as the ground rules, I didn't want to have to click on the enemy and then wait for the player character to execute the attack. Also, I didn't really see this game as a hack and slash or beat 'em up type of game, so I don't know if it would work well in this particular scenario. Maybe it would. I haven't really tested it. All I knew is that I wanted the player to be more involved in the combat and have it be more skill-based rather than stat-based. You see, with this particular project, even though I am going about it in an RPG-like fashion where there's quests and tasks, you can talk to the characters, they give you items, they give you things to do, it doesn't really involve player stats, at least not at the moment. So for the next little bit, I think what I'm going to be doing is experimenting with different approaches that I can take combat in. And this here was basically the very first idea I had. Since I want the player to be more involved in combat, maybe we can try to take one of the input devices that the user has and see if we can execute some commands that way, like for example, the mouse. So I had set up a quick enemy to take shots in, and he's going to be my dummy for experimenting with the various combat systems. And the very first idea I had was to create these orbs that the player would have to slash through with the mouse. It almost reminded me of the way you'd play a Fruit Ninja on your phones, where you just basically use a thumb and slice through the fruit and try to avoid touching stuff you're not supposed to touch. I figured that was kind of an interesting game mechanic, and maybe we could make this work within the context of this kind of a game. It would be skill-based, right? You'd have to be proficient with your motor skills. If you don't click fast enough, or if you shove your mouse into the corner of the screen and as a result you get killed, well, maybe that's because you gotta work on your coordination. I mean, as far as skill-based gameplay goes, this is very akin to you playing, say, CSGO, where your reaction to movement and you being able to aim very precisely and very quickly is going to determine whether or not you're going to win or lose your match. So initially what I had come up with is to have these little orbs that represent the enemy's hit damage and have them float around in the middle of space just to the side of your combat area, just so that it doesn't obscure the view of what's happening in front of you. And you have to take a mouse and slice through them. And that's essentially how you would deal damage to the enemy. Now, eventually I figured maybe having them to the side of the screen wasn't such a great idea, because you have this divide of what's happening in front of you and what's happening to the side of the character. Now, accounting for the fact that there might be multiple enemies surrounding you and you have to be able to attack all of them, I made the orbs orbit one another, each one representing a single enemy. Now, when you hit one enemy, you have to let go and click on the mouse button again, because you have to make sure that the player can't just strafe the mouse left and right, thus very rapidly dealing a large amount of damage because the hits are executed in a very short span of time. I still wasn't a fan of the fact that all of the action is happening on the side of the screen while the player himself is in the middle. So I kind of figured, what if we make the sphere invisible and instead align it with the character in front of us so that we're actually slicing straight through the character? This sort of seemed like it might actually work out quite well. Of course, we also had to consider how the enemy is going to be attacking the player and how the player could defend from the enemy attacks. And at that point, I was considering maybe there's going to be some sort of a red orb that flies towards the player, and the player has to slice it down in order to defend himself, to block himself from it. The initial tests seemed to have been promising. However, I did notice that there was a small strain on the wrist, especially when you're just slicing left and right across the enemy. There's very little variation in that sort of a movement, and I actually felt my wrists kind of start getting very slightly strained. And this was just me recording like a clip for 10 seconds or 15 seconds demonstrating the mechanic idea so far. And yeah, I don't know what's gonna happen when you have to do this for hours and hours on end. That's basically gonna be, you know, carpal tunnel simulator. Just gonna get instant RSI as soon as you open the main menu. Hey, maybe we can sell the cure as DLC. Anyways, that is not a good sign for this particular mechanic, so I decided to continue experimenting. I took a break from the combat system and decided to address a particular algorithm issue that I would have to definitely figure out if I was going to make this type of a game. The algorithm was to make sure that when you have characters, they can be rendered from 8 different directions. And not only that, those characters could be moving in some sort of a direction themselves. The issue was to figure out how to make it so that no matter from what angle you're looking at a character, and no matter to which direction that character is running towards, the sprite would always be displayed from the correct angle. Now, I was under the impression that this would involve a lot of vector math and a lot of angle math and a lot of trigonometry, and I didn't even know where to start. So I started by asking for help on the Godot Engines Discord server, and I left a question there, and I think within the next couple of hours, I actually got an answer from a gentleman who gave me a 2-line of code solution on how to get this to work. I was absolutely blown. I believe if you go into the Godot Engine's Discord and type in from my username, which is the Concept Boy, you can actually find my question. It would be, I think, in the programming section or beginner section in Discord server, and you'll just see the answer immediately. It's phenomenal. Just 2 lines of code. You feed it the vector that your character is walking towards, the position of the camera, and the position of the character himself, and that's it. It just it allows you to divide it by an X amount of slices. So you could have 4 directions, you can have 8 directions, you can have 16 directions, you can have however many directions you want. The formula, the 2-line formula, actually is very flexible, and all it does is it outputs an angle, and I simply rounded it, turned it into an integer, and I used that integer to select one of several keyframes inside of this particular animation. Now, for a character, I would be able to choose one of the several angles so that all the animations would be rendered from that particular angle. This does bring the question, how many animations are we gonna have to make? A lot. So I'm gonna have to be very careful with considering which NPCs can move and which NPCs should not move and just be stationary NPCs, because yeah, this is gonna be a lot of work. After figuring that out, I figured, you know what, let's tackle the attack system a little bit more, and I decided to try it in a bit of a different way. It still uses the mouse to attack the enemy, but this time, instead of attacking this one single location, you have to move your mouse in various places. It's all over the place. So there's no repetitive motion, but I'm not a doctor. I don't know what really defines a repetitive motion. I'm sure it's not just left and right movement, but I did know that my wrist wasn't really showing the signs of getting the same fatigue as when it was just a single orb and you just move the mouse across it left, right, left, right, left, right. I was feeling a little bit better about this particular system, so having finished working on that, I got a bit of an idea for a particular effect that might look kind of cool in Godot. It's essentially a reflection, like a puddle reflection on the ground. Now, to be able to achieve this, I would have to somehow get the reflection to work, which means I had to create both the albedo map, the color map that is, and the something that would set the roughness values of the puddle. Of course, the puddle had to be very smooth in the middle, and the dark inky outline would have to be very rough, so it doesn't reflect anything. I've spent a good several minutes trying to figure out how to get the reflections to work. I knew that in the post-processing node there was a screen space reflections, which seemed like exactly what I would need. Whatever the screen sees, the reflection in the puddle would just be the flipped version of that. But I couldn't seem to get it to work, and I wasn't really sure why, until I remembered my progress on the Angular project, and I realized that the reflection only works if you have a reflection probe, and screen space reflections are limited to a very short distance. So if I use screen space reflections, I cannot actually see the reflection of something from several meters away. It's only for very close proximity reflections. Now, unfortunately, even though I made the reflection probe be a single time capture and I made it be essentially a very small area, it did end up taxing my system a little bit too much for the effect to be worth it. So I saved it as a scene so I can come back to it later on. But at this point, it doesn't seem like the experiment was a success. I then wanted to get a little bit more familiar with the lighting tools I was going to be using to create the day-night cycle, the various conditions. This game has so far had its scene be set up in this nighttime environment. It's all cold colors. It's got very steep shadow, but for the most part, this was just for testing anyways. I wanted to get familiar with how I would go about setting up the sky, the environment. I knew from my previous experiments I wouldn't be able to use the procedural sky because in Godot, procedural sky cannot be dynamic. Anytime you change any property of the sky, like the position of the light, the rotation of the sky, any color settings, it has to recalculate the global reflections for or global illumination for the entire map, and that was actually causing a very visible stutter in one of my other projects, and I already knew that this was just not going to work. So to allow us to have a day and night cycle, I have to use very simple approach, just a simple set of light background color, fog color, fog density and height, and just play around with those values to get it to work. I tried getting a day-night scene. I tried getting a full complete nighttime scene. I tried to get almost this dusk looking scene, which actually turned out really cool. And honestly, I can't wait to implement some weather effects here where we have a little bit of rain, a little bit of fog in the morning, or just rolling fog that could be some sort of a threat, kind of like the radiation storms in Fallout or the psi storms in Stalker. It's this event that comes in and out on a schedule, and you're supposed to find shelter or build shelter really quick in order to kind of make it out alive. Now, when I was testing the nighttime scene, I did notice a bit of an issue. The player was getting completely blacked out by the surrounding environment, and there was technically one way I could fix it. If I were to assign a material to it, I could toggle on the translucency of the character sprite material, and that would allow a little bit of light from behind the player to seep in through to the front of the player, eliminating the side that you and I are actually looking at. The problem with that is that would also wash out some of the colors, so I had to find a different solution. My initial idea was to place a spotlight into the camera, which is of course always looking at the player, and make the spotlight shine at the player just far enough to reach the player's immediate environment. However, that ended up looking a little bit too much like there's just a flashlight always hovering behind the player, and it's almost like half the players holding the flashlight and shining somewhere, half us being the cameraman behind, and there's just a flashlight somewhere behind us or above us shining at the player. The effect wasn't really all that convincing, to be honest. Now, even though I was going to gut that particular feature, it did give me an idea for a lantern type object that the player is capable of controlling the brightness of. So if the player increases the brightness of the lantern, it would consume more fuel, but it will eliminate more of the surrounding area. And likewise, if the player is running low on fuel, the player can opt in to decrease the intensity. It wouldn't light up as much of an area around them, but it would last a little bit longer. And now, thinking of that solution, I realized to make the player illuminated in the complete darkness, why not just give the player his own Omnilight, which is essentially going to act as a very small range ambient lighting solution. It will eliminate the player sprite and also eliminate a little bit of the ground just beneath the player, but it wouldn't be anywhere enough to be able to tell any enemies that are approaching you from the distance. With the few remaining hours I had to work on this project for that week, I actually decided to maybe take this opportunity and actually make the lantern object itself. So we put together a quick little sprite, came out kind of looking a little trippy, but it would most likely get the job done, and if anything, we can always come back and create a new sprite for a replacement. I ended up scouting a couple of sounds on a website called Zapsplat. I have a membership with them, considering that I have a lot of projects that need a lot of sounds, and because of that, I figured it might just be worth it for, you know, what, $10, $14 a month to have access to a very large and very good quality library of sounds at a very convenient access point. You can very easily search up the sounds you need and download them very quickly. You don't have any download limitations with the premium account. You do have, I think, a 10 sound limit for the free account, and also if you use a free account, you have to credit them in your game. Now, with paid accounts, you have unlimited access, and you can download as many as you want, and you don't have to credit anyone, and that means that you guys can actually also use this resource for your games. You won't be able to batch download a whole bunch of sounds together, but 10 sounds an hour sounds like a pretty reasonable limit to get a few sounds and work on them a little bit, implement to the game. By that point, the 1 hour will pass, you can download some more. So this little lantern object, I ended up getting a sound of a match lighting up and the sound of a flame being put out. And the whole lantern light demanded an extra Omnilight within the player, which I ended up programming with a couple of light emission variables. One variable was responsible for flickering the light every 100 milliseconds. It would basically just generate a random float value that would determine the flicker amount, and the second float value would be controlling the brightness of the overall light, which means we can turn it on, turn it off, and it doesn't just get put out immediately. It actually loses its brightness over time, which I thought ended up working pretty well. However, now that I think about it, maybe to turn the light off, it's going to be almost instant. It's going to be a very rapid turn off. Like, you're actually blowing out the flame, and it stops emitting light almost instantly. However, turning it back on is going to be gradual. The second last thing for that day was to finally implement the dialog builder, the web-based dialog builder that I've been working on as a separate little project, into this game. Now, if you recall, in very early videos, I was trying to create a dialog/quest builder inside of this project using Godot Engine's user interface nodes, and I'm not really entirely sure why, but Godot Engine offers a huge variety of nodes, but I felt like that I had to do too much work to have every single object be updated, every single menu update itself when new objects or new variables come into play. If you add a particular item into your, let's say, item database, you had to go through all these nodes and updates all of their inputs, all of their drop-down menus. I don't know, but it just felt like there was too much work to be done for a tool that was going to be hard-coded into this game. Now, maybe I could have approached certain things in a bit of a different way to mitigate that, but I decided, you know what, I'll take my losses, and instead of developing this tool in Godot's own environment and making it a part of the game, instead I'm gonna make it into a web tool. So you've seen a video that I posted a little while ago, a small update of me publishing the tool. It is a web-based tool, runs off of the conceptbay.net website. You don't need to register an account for it. You could just go to there, go to tools, and you'll see Dialogi under the options. You could just click on it and start building your dialogue within that system. Now, that particular tool set is meant to create character dialogues with the ability to do all sorts of stuff, like have the characters ask a multiple choice question, and you, depending on the choice, you would go into a different branch of the dialogue. You would have the NPCs, say, give you quests during the dialogue, during a conversation, assign tasks, check if you have certain items in your inventory, give you items instead, all sorts of stuff that you would need to build a role-playing game. And it was finally time to just implement the structure. The dialogue builder would output the simple JSON file, just a regular text file containing JSON data, and all I had to do is I had to get an NPC to open a file that specifically belongs to them, a file that contains their specific dialogues, open it as plain text, convert it from JSON into a dictionary, and then just make it so that it has no trouble traversing that dictionary. Some of the key value pairs were a little bit different. I had to update them in my game, but if I do this once for this project, I can simply copy the entire dialogue system from this project, shove it into another one, and that's it. That project now has a dialogue system. I don't have to make another one quite literally ever again. So that is my primary focus of making the dialogue builder as a separate tool, because I can use that tool for any one of my games now. All I have to do is just migrate the dialogue system, the Godot side of the dialogue system, into that other project, and I'm good to go. So after about an hour and a bit of updating some key value pairs, I did get it to work, and that means that's it. I can now update my dialogues within the graphical user interface, add additional messages, add hundreds of additional messages without having to code a single additional line of code. That is just perfect. And I am glad that I decided to switch to web dev, because it actually it made the process of building that dialogue builder a lot faster, and at this point we're pretty much done. Now, at this point, I was pretty tapped out. I've done a lot of progress on this game, but I was kind of running out of ideas. So I figured as my last bit of progress for that day, I'm going to do a little bit of creative work, maybe get a new character in place. And I've had this idea of a character that's kind of like a traveling merchant, except a camel or a horse or a donkey. It's literally like a minivan, like an ice cream van, with some very, very strange proportions. So I put together a little sketch. The sketch wasn't working out. I started looking for references, which helped quite a lot. I ended up finding 2 references, one of a vending van and another one of this kind of like really old 50s looking truck. And all I took is just the proportions and the general shapes from the 2 of them, combined them together into this neat looking object. So this object is going to be designed in much the same way the house is designed. It is a 3-dimensional object with inks like comic book style textures on it. So can't wait to put that together, and can't wait to actually animate and draw the character who's going to be running this stand, because I think that's going to be kind of a quirky looking character. And that is all the progress we've made for this week for Child of Ether. Let's go ahead and move on to the next project. I had come across a particular issue where every time I exported the GLTF file with the animations for my character, it ended up screwing up some sort of a pose right at the start of the bake, and this was visible both within Blender and Godot engine at the same time, and for the life of me, I could not figure out what the heck was happening. Initially, I started figuring maybe it might be the scaling issue, because technically my mesh wasn't scaled to 1:1:1, because the original mesh came from a program called Make Human, and I had to scale it down to make it fit within the scope of the entire game, within the scope of the scale of the world, and I may not have applied the scale, and I thought that was what was causing the issue. Then I figured, okay, maybe this was some sort of a rogue frame and I had to reanimate the poses. Except when I did, it worked fine, but then another animation would get screwed up, and I'm thinking, what's going on? This is giving me Vietnam flashbacks to back when I was figuring out animations for Dream Team Theater FPS animations, with the gun and the hands being 2 separate rigs. It took me a lot of time to figure out what was wrong, and here I'm having a seemingly the same issue where the animations are screwing themselves up. And I realized after checking up with some folks on the Blender Discord, and somebody was willing to take a look at my files, I realized that I had a distance constraint set up on my rig in order to prevent my inverse kinematics limbs from flying off, or having them be animated by such a way where I may not notice and I pull them to a little bit too much, which would stretch the arm, and I may not catch it in time. It would be in the final game. So I had set up these distance constraint limits in order to prevent the arms from leaving their maximum stretch range. I'm literally T-posing right now as I'm explaining this. And that is actually, that was the constraint that was causing the issue. So I didn't really have to disable the constraint. As far as I knew, I just had to bake the animations, and this is a very common practice. I figured first few animations worked out just fine without baking, so maybe the Blender gods have smiled upon me, and I could get the animations done without this extra step of baking. It's not like baking takes a lot of time. It's just save a step, save a minute, whatever. But nope, apparently it causes issues later down the line. So from now on, I have to make sure that I bake my animations, and the issue pretty much went away from that point on. It does kind of infuriate me when I reach one of these types of errors or glitches, and there's just no way to figure out by yourself. You have to go ask the community and pray to God somebody's going to be willing to take a look at your files, because everyone's project is different. So most of the time, unless it's a very simple question, you have to provide some sort of source files, which means providing the original files to my project. Now, this introductory dream sequence is but a part to a larger introduction sequence of the entire game, where a lot of the narrative components are laid down, the exposition is presented, the player's core problem is presented, and the intrigue is built up. So the necessity to figure out these problems is kind of immediate, because we are going to be using the same exact features we're using now throughout the next little while. This dream sequence is only a part of the scripted events that are supposed to happen. Right after the dream sequence, we're supposed to get our protagonist in his current age and his current set of problems, and there's this whole behavior dialogue, relationship dialogue we have to figure out between the protagonist, who is the player, who is the prisoner being taken back to the Imperial Army, and the Imperial Sergeant, who is responsible for delivering us. And of course, all the scripted events that have to come with that, like the discovery of the alien vessel, the arrival, the fly around, making sure that everything kind of renders okay, and we don't have any, well, too much of a set of glitchy shadows. You know, set up the music, set everything, all the scripted events, all the dialogues in that case. So getting these systems up and running is going to be important for that as well, just as important to get it to work. Now, at this point, we are on flashback number 2, which is actually just about wrapping up. What I have to do here is I have to program a whole bunch of props to appear and disappear based on which flashback is currently taking place. It's honestly, I would call this a super janky approach, because everything is kind of purpose coded or purpose built specifically for this cutscene, but we are not going to be reusing this environment in any other places in the game, so I feel like in this particular case it might be alright. I tend to think in heavily modular systems, like for example reusable systems like lighting adjustment systems, which is in fact what I ended up programming here. A whole separate system specifically for switching lighting between flashbacks, which is also going to be useful for switching lighting between the zones of the alien spaceship that the player is going to be entering and leaving. So I tend to think in really modular systems that can just be programmed once and reused throughout the rest of the game, which ends up giving the whole game kind of a RPG-like feel, where the entire game is basically just built around the same set of mechanics, and you're just going around kind of doing more or less the same action, and the challenge there is to make that be more varied, of course, which is essentially introducing an element of surprise or element of randomness or element of a unique approach to something that is inherently repeatable and predictable. Now, even though this particular scene is mainly for establishing the relationship between the protagonist and the father, there is actually a lot we can do to do other world telling, environmental storytelling. Like, for example, the living room is pretty much positioned right adjacent to the window, and what I decided to do is I decided to set up the when this story is being told, to answer the question of when, and to do that I was actually thinking of essentially creating a miniature of the city right outside the window, with little tiny spaceships flying by, little tiny advertisement billboards, make them very small, shrink them quite a bit, and make use of the false perspective that this miniature, almost like a diorama set, would grant us. Now, this would only work if the player is unable to move around and assess the actual real dimension of the cityscape by, you know, moving from side to side and then comparing the vision. The whole perception of depth would kick into play, and then the player would of course say, oh no, this is not a city, this is just a little tiny toy perhaps, or some sort of a hologram. Now, because our player is in a cutscene, they do not have freedom of movement. They are stuck within whatever point of view we place them in, and because of that they cannot move around and they cannot compare the sizes of objects based on different positions, and they can't extrapolate that what they're seeing is actually something that's really close but small, rather than something that's really huge but very far away. This is a little trick that a lot of games actually end up using to create fake perspective, to create a sense of very vast depth without actually committing to large amounts of very intricate and huge geometry. In a lot of these cases, in order to showcase something that's super huge in scope, in size, you actually have to tremendously increase the render distance of your camera, and that's where things just become very iffy, especially with objects that are just far, far, far away. Something in the math of your computer is just incapable of correctly rendering vertices at that such a vast distance. So this is where you end up with developers creating some very unique approaches to dealing with this. Like, for example, with Half-Life, you have the developers create these box projections where they just create a very small miniature, let's say, of the Citadel, and they have a camera inside there, and that camera is effectively kind of positioning itself roughly where the player would be if this was a real object. But instead of making a ginormous Citadel, which would require your camera to have a render distance of like thousands of kilometers, instead they just kind of have a cube that is rendering the projection of that camera, and it's as if this huge colossal object is there, when in reality you're just looking at a still render of it. So by setting up this futuristic city, we would take care of the setup of what age does this story take place in. It's very important to lay down this information quite early on. This is, after all, the flashback that the player sees within the first few minutes of pressing start in the main menu. So it's important to lay down things like the theme of the story, the subject, the idea, and then preferably answering the question of who, what, when, where, why. Now, having figured out this cursed problem with the animations, I was actually finally free to move on with the setup of the flashback. And when I implemented the dialogue, I realized, you know what, this dialogue doesn't actually seem to fit the narrative that I am trying to push. It was more about setting up kind of a interpersonal relationship between heroes without any sustenance in it, so to speak, without any merit or relation to the total theme. Initially, the protagonist is as a little kid asking, it's like, why is the father not as much around the family as he wishes he could? And then the father goes into just very abbreviated explanation of how the world works and how, you know, life's tough living, and it's very difficult to sustain yourself in this day and age, which kind of relates to, well, it really relates to the age that you and I are living in, you know, with the rent being $2,000-$3,000. Oh, Jesus. But I figured, you know what, it doesn't really fit the theme, which is more about heroism. It's more about what it's like to be a hero, what it means to be a hero. And I decided to switch up the dialogue entirely. I ended up rewriting the vast majority of the dialogue to have the father and son have a conversation of what is going on with the conflict between the Imperial and the rebellion of planets trying to cut themselves off from the Imperial influence, and how they're viewed as terrorists, and they're being told one thing at school, but it's the father kind of explains the reason behind it, what is the relationship between it, and how some people that they knew ended up becoming enemies of state because they decided to fight for their own planet. I thought it laid down the concept of the theme that the story wanted to concentrate on a lot better than the previous conversation. So that meant I was finally able to move on to flashback number 3. Now, the flashback number 3 is the point when the father figure is being recalled to war. Being a veteran himself, technically he has served his time, but due to the rising conflicts and the military demands, he is being recalled back into service by the Imperial Army. This is supposed to throw a huge wrench into the relationship between the father and the son. The son, being very young and very inexperienced, doesn't really reflect or showcase his emotions on the subject in a healthy way. And the way he will express his distaste for this event will end up being one of the driving forces of regret for the main character throughout the story. As a matter of fact, it's going to be one of the primary motivators for the main character to make it a life's goal to never have anything to do with the Imperial Army, even though youth drafting is still a capital offense in this universe. So that means that for this particular flashback, I also had to set up the scene where the father is being drafted. The father has a conversation with the two Imperial officials. Again, we are making use of Make Human to create our base models and give them some sort of an outfit. I am gonna be looking for other tools, and I think I've been linked some other tools for character creation, which for a project like this would come in very handy, except after these two officials and maybe the protagonist's mother figure, which doesn't really have a lot of presence in the narrative, is pretty much all the character models that we're gonna need. The rest is either already modeled or it's like an alien creature that really needs to be custom made. We've spent a bunch of time experimenting with the lighting and the general composition of the scene. I had a lot of control, or added a lot of control over the drapery in the living room. So for the flashback number 2, when the father and the son have a kind of a close talk, the drapery is pretty much going to be open and the player can have a very visible sight of the city. But when the Imperial officials will show up, I wanted to shade the Imperial officials in darkness to give them a more sinister feel, but at the same time, I wanted to make sure that this entire scene doesn't appear as if it's some sort of a meeting of coercion, as if the father is involved in some sort of anti-Imperial deeds, like he's a rebel or something. So it was very important to lay that down, and I thought I could pull that off by basically covering the father figure in light in order to try to cut off that particular idea from the visual feedback, and while the other half of the drapery would be covering the half of the living room in darkness, and that's exactly where the two Imperial officials would be sitting in. It was really important to make sure that the father does not come off as a villain or does not come off as somebody who has ulterior motives or their own personal agenda. So I ended up doing exactly the same thing I did for the second flashback when I wanted to obscure the father's face a little bit to make this whole dream sequence feel like a dream where the faces aren't necessarily clear, but you know exactly who the people are. I ended up placing some hidden lights or some light sources that explicitly shine onto the father figure in order to give them additional lights where the sunlight or the directional light was just not able to illuminate the body as well. I didn't end up doing any animations because I simply wanted to set down some props. As a matter of fact, the father figure and the Imperial official, one of the two Imperial officials, are just sitting in midair, and at that point I gave the modelers helping out with the project to model a lazy boy chair and a sofa, which are going to be the props on top of which the characters are going to be sitting. Another note that I will definitely have to address in the future is I have to very carefully set up the positioning of the character heights. It's a very common quirk in film to put the dominating character above the eye level or the head level of the subject, the opposite subject. So for example, if the protagonist is being threatened by a bunch of bandits, the bandits in every camera shot have to be positioned and situated higher than the main character. It's a subconscious trick that gives you the impression that they have the higher ground. They have the dominant hand. They have the ace in the up the sleeve. They have an advantage, and they're dominating them with their aura. And right now the father's head level is actually above the Imperial officials, which kind of makes him look like he is in charge or he is higher ranking than these henchmen, so to speak, like Imperial officials, when in reality he is just a citizen, and the Imperial officials have authority over him. So we have to kind of work on that scene and position the characters a little bit better. Now, one final note on this particular stage in the project, I was really trying to recreate this dreamy sensation with these various components, like for example texturing everything in just black and white monochrome textures, wrapping the view with this white vignette to give it more dreamy sensation. And the final thing that I thought was gonna tie it all together and really communicate that this is a dream sequence was by making the camera not be hard tied to the mouse movement. In order to do that, I had to make the camera, actually I had to make a secondary camera, the one that's explicitly existing within the scene for the sole purpose of being a dream camera. And what I had done is I made this camera not be tied to the position or the rotation of the camera controls, but instead I made it slowly interpolate its own transforms, which is location, rotation, scale data, to the local transforms of the player camera. As a matter of fact, it was all done in global transforms instead of local transforms. Now, this made it possible for me to make the camera through which we view this whole dream sequence to be very slacked. It had a very rubbery feel to it, and that made the effect absolutely perfect. But it also made me discover a very interesting camera panning, or almost like a dolly effect, because between the scenes, what I do is I fade the screen to white and I execute a function, a custom function I've put together to reposition the characters and the props within the scene for the next flashback, and then I fade out back into the view. And what ended up happening is the player is moved instantly by the function, but this dream camera, because it slowly interpolates its transforms, ended up slowly flying across the level, across the geometry, until it ended up reaching the actual player's camera and lining with it. Now, that smooth transition actually turned out to be quite a cool effect. And I thought, in order to make this cutscene to feel a little bit more alive or a little bit more dynamic, I will implement this slow camera fade or slow camera slide into every flashback and position it in such a way where it makes sense. Like, for example, in the intro, the camera kind of slides from the door because I want the door to be in the view. In the second flashback, the camera slides from the left of the father because I wanted the father to be the primary subject that we notice first, and then of course when it aligns we can see the little army toys on the desk. And of course the third flashback, the camera flies from the kid's bedroom past the kitchen and just positioning itself right around the corner as if it's a kid peeking on his father, having that meeting of him being drafted back into the army. That's how the protagonist overhears that conversation. The protagonist, being a child, understands the weight of the situation. He knows that he's not going to see his father anymore. His father is leaving, and that is going to put a wrench into the relationship. And this little camera slide effect seemed to actually look a little bit better than if the camera simply started out already in place, as we have seen already up until this point. So it was just nothing more than a random discovery, and I'm kind of happy that I saw this. This actually gave me a really cool idea for this feature. So this is all we have for this week for Angular. It may seem like there's way less work done on this than it was on the Child of Ether, but in reality, I just had a lot more to discuss in that project than I do in this one. It's pretty clear what's happening here, working on the intro dream sequence. So why don't we go ahead and move on to the next project. Dreadtail. It is a working title for my retaliation for not making it on time for that game jam that I was making the Angular project for. It is essentially just a dumb single level survive the night game. You arrive in the woods because you didn't make it in time before nightfall, and now you have to scrounge for supplies to put together little contraptions and little devices to ward off the paranormal entities that haunt that forest in a paranormal post-apocalyptic event world. Now, I'm gonna have to rip off this band-aid early on because somebody is going to find out the truth anyways. This game is inspired by me watching Game Grumps play this atrocious ripoff of a Slenderman game called Hentai Horror, The 8 Pictures. So, yeah. Look, I was baffled to see Game Grumps play this shit. I have no idea how it ended up landing on their radar. All I knew is that I was fuming that this shit actually got screen time. And that's when I thought, I can make crap like this. Come on, man. Now, I know the statistics. I know that for every one horrendous, terrible game that YouTubers play, there's 100,000 of those that they don't. So it's not exactly an argument. But it did get me thinking, I did miss out on the game jam, and I didn't get to release a little minigame, which is something I haven't done in a while, and, you know, not releasing some sort of a progress for a while does things to your motivation. I figured, you know what, maybe I should take on a very short, purposefully oriented mini project so that I could just have something to release, a small minigame, very short, very sweet. It's horror, so it's not gonna be sweet, and just put that on my resume. In my age, with my experience level, I should be capable enough to produce a short game within a reasonably short amount of time and put it up on Steam. So yeah, it's a really dumb way to come up with a project or to start a project, but the motivation behind it is quite serious. I want to put a project on my resume, and most of the projects I'm working on right now are, well, a few months to a year away from being anywhere around the point of being presentable. So, what is the idea for this project? Well, it is going to be a survive the night in a haunted wood type of adventure. It will be randomly arranged. The forest is essentially just a very large terrain map with lots and lots of trees scattered all around. There's only 3 tree variations, so I'm not going too over the top with modeling. The trees themselves come from a 3D tree pack that I had purchased for the use in the Automacon project, so that's also no extra work at all. I am essentially trying to minimize as much unnecessary work as I have to do. Now, the lore of this game takes place in the same universe as this series of very short horror stories that I've been putting together, but I have no idea what to do with them. It takes place in a world that has experienced a paranormal cataclysm, a worldwide Armageddon-level event, which had rendered the planet almost inhabitable because of a consistent presence of this black fog that circulates the planet, consuming anything living in its path. Now, in this story, the main protagonist is a woman who had been separated from her family, and she is trying to get reunited by passing through a trail that leads to the mountaintops. The exposition of the story will point out that the fog has trouble penetrating the upper layers where the mountain peaks are located, and it so happens to be that that's exactly where her family had gotten to in search for a safe harbor. She tries to go through the trail that leads up to the mountains, but doesn't make it in time. Dusk comes, and that's when the land, which had previously been covered by the dark fog, ends up becoming hyperactive in its paranormal entities. So the forest within which the players find themselves, and I do mean the players, I do want to see if I can make this into an online co-op game, the players end up finding themselves running around the forest and collecting resources to put together little trinkets to fend themselves off from whatever type of paranormal entities I decide to set up in the forest. Now, I am toying with an idea of making invisible enemies that only become visible right up until the point when they decide to attack you, when they get close to you. This particular idea ties both into the fact that I am looking to spend as little amount of time developing this and just put it out there, and also it has an interesting approach to forcing the player to listen, which is an idea I've really wanted to toy in for a couple of past projects. But every single time, wild imagination takes over, and I design this weird enemy that I then have to animate, and I have to rig, and I have to get them to traverse the environment. It's a lot of work. So in this case, I'm gonna see if I can force the player to concentrate to listen. This forest is an off-limits location. It is a place that the dark fog had previously traversed, leaving the land highly paranormally active. And as a result, when the level loads up, the layout of the forest changes by a slight bit. Now, the way I'm going to achieve that is by simply creating the entire static terrain and creating all the trees, all the foliage. That part is going to be static. However, the forest is going to be filled with chunks of interesting locations, like an abandoned church, a chunk of a military bunker that was situated underground that was ripped up apart, a piece of a windmill, a telephone post that the player can climb up on and evade some sort of an enemy, an overland pipe aggregate that you would usually see in some sort of an industrial area. The forest is going to be filled with these locations of interest, which the player has to find, because each location will offer a plentiful set of resources that the player can put into their inventory, find a workbench, and craft whatever deterrents and safety mechanisms they have to in order to make it through the night. Not only that, I am looking to randomize the locations with each and every time you play the game. So in one session, the middle of the forest may have a piece of windmill that you would see on an old farm, but in another playthrough, you would find nothing. On the third playthrough, you could find a piece of the underground military bunker. The layout of the land always changes, and I'm using that term fairly loosely because I'm not really planning on introducing any terrain variations or randomizations, different layouts for the trees, because all the trees pretty much look the same. Making some sort of a mental map of the different locations and trying to recognize where you might be located is probably not going to be such a common thing unless you have a particular knack for such things. Not only that, because of the sheer amount of trees within the land, we cannot render it all at once. So I'm going to be borrowing a trick from the Silent Hill book, and I'm going to be limiting the draw distance of the player's camera, then covering up that draw distance limit with a bunch of fog, which brings a particular problem of how is the player supposed to navigate within this forest if everything looks the same? Are they just supposed to blindly walk around until they stumble upon some sort of a location? Well, this is where one of the mechanics in this game comes into play. Now, a little while ago, Dusk Dev had released a minigame called Iron Lung, which has been since picked up by many streamers, and lots of videos been made on that. And I thought that the concept of never seeing the actual exterior of the environment and only having to use a map and a coordinate system, a GPS, to tell where you are located was quite an interesting and unique way to traverse the level. Now, in our case, we're not piloting a submarine, but nevertheless, we do have a very limited draw distance and we have a very vast level. So I figured I'm going to introduce a map along with a GPS device. When the player presses a button on the GPS device, it reports their current location. They have to then find that location on the map, and if you are playing in co-op, you can then communicate that location to your fellow players. Now, since the locations of interest in this forest are randomly generated, it makes sense that the player has to have the ability to mark their current location on the map and leave a little note, which is the next mechanic that I ended up programming into this game. Now, we don't go about displaying the player's current location because then it pretty much voids the need for the GPS, but I wanted that process to be a little bit more manual and a little bit slower pace. And it's contrasted by the looming threat that roams these forests, so you have to be kind of careful. You have to listen. You have to be mindful of how much noise you make, because every time you open and close the inventory, craft something, open and close the map, place a dot, there's going to be a sound effect which will obscure your ability to hear the environment. So you may not hear the footsteps that are charging at you at that very moment. I wanted to make this game to be based around sound. Now, I'm not gonna lie, it does make my life a lot easier if I don't have to create all sorts of intricate animations for whatever is chasing and hunting us. And yes, it does sound kind of lazy, but you know what? That's my creative decision to make in this case, so I'm gonna go with the lazy way. Remember, I just want to make a game. I just want to get it done. Come on. Now, this project actually shares in a lot of the game mechanics that I have already done to death in a lot of my other projects, like, for example, the inventory system and the crafting system. I've created these systems so many times by now that they're pretty much a second nature. It's almost akin to me creating a new project, and I already know what to do. The player would be able to use their inventory system to collect the plentiful resources that are scattered all over the locations of interest within this forest, and then use those items in crafting recipes to create their defenses. I'm planning on splitting the entire night into multiple stages. Those stages include things like simply walking around and discovering the locations of interest. They include evading the black smoke that is going to be enveloping the entire forest, forcing the player to find higher ground to wait it out. A stage where the hunting has become more prominent and they now have to expand the resources they've collected to this point and use up the tools they've crafted to this point. And it will all boil down to the players collecting all the resources they can find, identifying a particular location which they are going to be using as a stronghold, then repairing and barricading that stronghold so that they can prepare for the oncoming wave, which is going to be the climax of the entire survival point. The core gameplay loop is simple: survive the night, and throughout the night there's going to be a series of events they have to overcome, and it all leads up to this one final stand sort of event right before the sun rises. Now, there is a secondary objective. I did mention that some of the locations of interest are essentially chunks of a military bunker. This military bunker ties into the lore of this game as well as the lore of a couple of other games that I'm working with my students. Even though surviving the night is the primary objective of the player, there is a secondary puzzle that is baked into the game where the players have to locate the individual bunker chunks and enable certain subsystems, connect them back together, and unravel the main mystery of what happened to this bunker. Why is it ripped to chunks? This is a structure that used to be underground and now it's scattered in pieces all over the surface. And this is really where my love for science fiction and mystery, and especially when those two come together, really comes through. You always gotta have that mystery. Can't live without it. So for the past few weeks, we've been primarily concentrating on modeling, texturing, setting up the props, setting up the inventory system, and just getting the basics up and running so that we can have the foundation to build up the rest of the gameplay on. Now, before I got an idea to go for invisible enemies, I was toying with a concept of these tree imps, or these vine-like creatures that are essentially remnants of the humans that the fog has consumed. But it's, again, as soon as I create a character, I have to think that I have to animate it, which means I also have to rig it, which also means we have to make sure the animation sits right in the environment. It's this whole can of worms that comes bundled with me wanting to create a three-dimensional character in a game. The concept behavior of this character is pretty much just like what you'd have with the Slender Man, where he would appear behind the player on a certain timer, and if the player turns around and sees them, there's a horror sound that plays. And I even gotten as far as implementing a little bit of a whispering sound effect that indicates that one of these creatures is actually about to spawn. Eventually, the whispering part got me hinted towards the idea of doing silent enemies, so meaning that the sound wouldn't really always come from behind you, but it would come from whatever the enemy is around you, and now you have to very carefully listen to the direction of that and leave the hell away from that place. Now, if that enemy starts charging you, it will have to make itself visible, but there I am actually inclined to use this model here as it actually fits quite well. It's humanoid, but it's not distinctive enough, and I can attach some particles to it, showcasing some sort of a weird drooping effect. When it comes to inventory items, I am really trying to keep this thing as low but as versatile as possible. So far on my list are ingredients like duct tape, 12-volt batteries, 55-volt batteries, which is kind of a weird number to have, tin cans to be used as the containers for the gadgets you will be creating, a flash bulb, and a capacitor. You take the 12-volt battery, tin can, flash bulb, and the capacitor, you craft them together into a flash grenade or some sort of like a flash deterrent. One of these crafted devices is good enough for maybe 2 or 3 executions, so it's not just a one-time disposable item, and the player would be able to take the batteries out and charge them using the many scattered scattered hand crank charging stations. Essentially, it's just a dynamo machine. It's a motor with a crank on it. You spin the crank, it produces electricity, and you use that to charge your 12 and 55 volt batteries. Now, the batteries don't only have a use inside of these devices. The level is going to be littered with light poles and little park lights, which the player can interact with by unscrewing a side panel and plugging up a battery, which forces that light to turn on, and thus the player can then use that as a little safe haven from the surrounding enemies. This is actually an idea that I'm borrowing from the Alan Wake game, where the human population of the town that Alan Wake finds himself in is basically consumed by this mythical evil presence that is defeated by light. And if Alan stands inside of a light cone of a park light, he is actually standing in the safe zone. Besides the various light sources, the player also can plug in these lights into the fuse boxes within the various chunks of the military bunker scattered all over the forest. By plugging in the battery, the player can gain access to a particular functionality of that section of the bunker. So the player can enable technology that used to be situated in that bunker before the event that ripped the bunker apart had taken place, and this ties into the main mystery which the player can unravel by completing a particular puzzle that involves all these bunker chunks being re-enabled and operating together. I am really trying to keep this as small as possible because this is something I have never been able to do. All of my projects have blown out of proportion and it really infuriates me. This is also going to be the first time I'm going to be attempting to make a co-op game in Godot. I have made network co-op in Game Maker Studio with some small prototypes before. I am familiar with the process, and apparently Godot offers some additional layers that are supposed to ease up that process by sending some variables over the network for us, giving us the ability to specify what we would like to keep synchronized, which is really nice. But that is going to be a whole new experience for me. If I do pull it off, it's probably just going to be a simple P2P sort of connection, one player playing with another. I know that Steam does offer peer-to-peer connection tunneling, which means it allows you to create a game that does not require one of the players, who is going to be the server, to have to port forward their network, which is something that, you know, not every player has access to their router, and not every parent is going to let their player go around messing with network settings and potentially screwing something up. We all know how scaredy parents can be, so better leave it alone. I'm also not looking to make this into a publicly server-hosted game because that would require dedicated servers, which requires security measures, which requires additional infrastructure, which of course requires anti-cheat resolutions. It is probably outside the scope of what this is, which is supposed to be a very small project. I can already see a lot of hassle with synchronizing the data between players, so I don't need an entire level of additional complexity on top of that. Again, trying to keep this one small. So this is the progress we have made so far. Technically, I have done a lot more progress on this game, but I can only make a video on the content that has been uploaded to my website, and I am on a limit since I'm using Vimeo for hosting my video content, and I only get about 20 gigabytes of weekly upload limit to do that, so I have to kind of distribute that between all the projects. There's quite a bit more that I've done on this, but for now, this is all I'm going to cover, and I hope to see you guys in the next video. Hope you really enjoy these, and you can always find the full videos, the full production videos for all these projects on my website, theconceptbay.net. It is basically my personal Patreon where you have access to all the production videos for all the projects you see on this channel. So I hope you've enjoyed these. I hope you are going to stay in touch with the production of these projects, with the progress. I hope you get to play these games someday, and we'll see you guys in the next update video.